Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of the Take Your Shot podcast. Of course, as always, I am your wonderful host, Joshua Gitman. And I don't know if all of you heard last Friday night, but there was a blockbuster trade in the NBA. Karl-Anthony Towns is going to the New York Knicks. And on today's episode, we are going to break down every single aspect of that trade right here, right now on the Take Your Shot podcast. Let's get started with the trade details because it originally seemed like this was going to be a trade with just the Knicks and just the Timberwolves, but the new CBA requires teams that are in the first apron to send out more money than they are bringing back in. So both Minnesota and New York needed to do that. So it was not possible to do a two-team trade. So they needed a team that was below the first apron and not in the luxury tax, have some plus cap room, a team that can absorb salary, and that was the Charlotte Hornets in this case. So the full trade details: the Knicks got Karl-Anthony Towns and draft rights to James Nagy, who was a draft pick in last year's draft in the second round for the Charlotte Hornets. The Minnesota Timberwolves got Julius Randle, Donte DiVincenzo, and Keita Bates-Diop, along with a future lottery-protected first-round pick from the Detroit Pistons, which means that pick's probably useless. The Charlotte Hornets got Charlie Brown, Daquan Jeffries, Dwayne Washington Jr., two future second-round picks from the New York Knicks, and the Timberwolves gave a 2025 second-round pick along with cash considerations. That is the full trade, and we are going to break down both teams, the New York Knicks and the Minnesota Timberwolves, in this trade. And let's start with the New York Knicks as they decide to make this bold move and go all in with Karl-Anthony Towns. When I first pulled up my phone and I saw this trade, I was like, wow, this was an interesting one because New York really was going in a great direction. They got Mikal Bridges in the offseason. They were looking like they were going to be a contender in the East. We could imagine their starting lineup. Yes, they had a hole at center, but the rest of the roster, the depth, and the other four guys who are probably going to be starting were pretty well situated and were pretty comfortable with the New York Knicks system. So when I saw the trade, I was like, wow, this is a surprising one. And even for Minnesota's side, it was also surprising as well. But now that I had to digest it for a little bit, I had some time to think about it, I'm going to give you every single thought I have on the trade. And let's start with the center void for the New York Knicks, because the Knicks, clearly, it was pretty obvious that they needed a center all along. After Mitchell Robinson went down, the Knicks' only real option to probably start at center was Precious Achiuwa. And I mean, no offense to Precious Achiuwa, great role player and all that, but the Knicks have high expectations this season, so they really wanted a starting center, someone who had the experience, someone who could come in and just fit in with the system right away, someone who could provide some defense, someone who can get some boards, a little bit better than Precious Achiuwa, and most importantly, someone who can stretch the floor. And Karl-Anthony Towns, I mean, it hasn't really been pretty loud and clear that he was going to be available, but I guess New York thought that this was the best option we were going to get, taking a look around at all the other top centers at the league, taking a look at probably the other centers open in the marketplace looking to be shipped by other teams. Karl-Anthony Towns was probably the best option available, and the Knicks did not want to wait on that. I thought it was interesting because, again, as I said earlier, I thought the Knicks had it going well, getting Mikal Bridges, just adding that piece to this roster that they had last season, basically losing in the second round because of injuries. Probably were going to make the conference finals. You add Bridges to the mix. Okay, now you have a shot against Boston, and now you completely alter your team with this trade. So I thought it was a little bit interesting, but the Knicks did get that center. Maybe they could have waited till the trade deadline if Minnesota wasn't doing so hot, but maybe they thought that Minnesota was going to do well with the roster they had, and if that they were shipping and looking to trade Karl-Anthony Towns, it would be only a necessity to do it now because that opportunity probably wouldn't be available later on near the trade deadline. But for the Knicks, this definitely fills that void. He can stretch the floor. He can run the pick and roll with Jalen Brunson. Not even the pick and roll, if you think about it, the pick and pop with Jalen Brunson. He spreads out the floor. He opens up the offense. He opens up the paint. He's not going to be someone who's sitting in the paint, not giving room and opportunity for guys like Jalen Brunson and for Mikal Bridges to get to their spots inside. as well. So I think for what Thibodeau has, what his scheme is, what he's been doing with this offense, especially with the star in Jalen Brunson, I think this is a perfect move, just getting another guy who can stretch the floor and stretch the perimeter. And now you look at the Knicks starting five, you could arguably make the case that it is going to be the best starting five in the league with Brunson, Bridges, Anunoby, Josh Hart, and Karl-Anthony Towns. Bridges and Anunoby, of course, are going to be your defensive gurus. And one of the concerns that we had with this Karl-Anthony Towns trade was definitely the defensive aspect of it, because we know Karl-Anthony Towns is not the best at defense compared to other centers in the league. And I think he's had that reputation in Minnesota to the point where, oh, can he fit in with this Knicks team? But I think that OG Anunoby is going to be someone who can potentially get in there and guard some big men, especially if Karl-Anthony Towns is struggling. I think that's why the Knicks were okay with this, because they know that there are other guys on this team who can guard big men. Like, we've even seen Josh Hart step up to the challenge and guard bigger players as well. But you look at this Knicks starting five, you look at this closing lineup, it is elite. It is, in my opinion, the best, if not one of the best currently in the NBA. So you really like it in that aspect. And we know the Knicks had a lot of defense. That was their specialty. And one thing maybe that the Knicks could have improved on was definitely scoring production. And Karl-Anthony Towns is going to give you that, especially with the loss of Donte DiVincenzo. I'm assuming that the Knicks probably didn't want to do this trade with Donte DiVincenzo, but at the end of the day, he's the best center available, Karl-Anthony Towns. And if you really want him that bad, you have to do what you have to do. So I'm assuming that the Knicks thought it over and were like, okay, if we have to lose DiVincenzo, we know that at least Karl-Anthony Towns can shoot the ball pretty good. Maybe not at the clip DiVincenzo shot at last year, but at least a decent number to where it can make up his production. But it's an interesting approach because obviously they play different positions, not really the same kind of role on the team that DiVincenzo had last year compared to probably what Karl-Anthony Towns is going to have this season. So there's that aspect of that. But at the end of the day, the Knicks thought it hard, and I mean, they decided to make this change. And it's very interesting for both sides, once again, because it felt like both teams were ascending. We didn't really expect the Timberwolves to make any changes after making the conference finals and having a great season, beating the Denver Nuggets and making it far in the playoffs. The New York Knicks, a couple injuries away from getting their shot at the Boston Celtics. It looked like getting Mikal Bridges, they were going to ascend, not having to give up many other players. But now they both decide to change, and it's going to be interesting to see the adjustments that both teams are going to have to make. And Karl-Anthony Towns is going to get a lot of pressure on this New York Knicks fan base. The Knicks are going all in. You can see it on the screen right now. This is an all-in move for the New York Knicks. They have no more depth. They gave up all their depth in the Mikal Bridges trade and in this trade. Their bench now is Miles McBride and Precious Achiuwa. That is it. Maybe they make a move near the trade deadline to get something else, because it does not look like to me that the Knicks are going to be done considering what their bench looks like right now. Maybe they'll get one more piece, but they are going all in. Remember, the New York Knicks, before the trade deadline last year, had all these assets. They had all these first-round picks. They had the bench depth. They had options to make a move. And then they trade Barrett and quickly for OG Anunoby. Then they trade Bogdanovich, 5 first-round picks for Mikal Bridges. Did I forget to mention that 2 first-round picks went in the deal for OG Anunoby? Then you go out now and trade Donte DiVincenzo, another key piece on your depth, for Karl-Anthony Towns. So this is the roster. This is the Knicks. They're going to have a window now where it's all or nothing, because if this doesn't work out for the Knicks, it's not going to work out. This is their window. This is their chance. We said it when they got Mikal Bridges, but now we're emphasizing it because the Knicks now are in a position where they don't have a lot of wiggle room to make a lot of trades. They don't have the picks to maybe get out of some stuff. This is it. And there is going to be an immense amount of pressure on Karl-Anthony Towns because this is the guy who's supposed to push the Knicks over the limit. He's supposed to be the number 2 on this championship team. And maybe Karl-Anthony Towns thinks he's going to be the best player, and I hope he has that mindset going in. But again, this is Jalen Brunson's team. Everyone loves Jalen Brunson in New York. He was the Knicks' savior. Got him to the second round last year. Got him to the second round after last season. This Jalen Brunson kid is beloved by every single person in New York. Karl-Anthony Towns is going to be the one to take the blame on a lot of things. You thought Julius Randle had it bad with the New York Knicks crowd. Wait for Karl-Anthony Towns when he has a bad game, because we know Karl-Anthony Towns' attitude. He's not this perfect guy. He's a little bit lazy on defense. He complains at the refs. He gets in some foul trouble. This is not going to be smooth every single game, and there is going to be a lot of pressure considering that city, where this team is right now, and where this team hopes to be in this championship window of 3 to 4 years. So it's not going to be easy for Karl-Anthony Towns. He came from Minnesota. Minnesota wasn't doing anything until the last couple of seasons where they made their ascent with Anthony Edwards. Karl-Anthony Towns was sitting there in Minnesota as the best player on a non-playoff team. Now he goes into a situation, not the best player anymore. Now he's actually competing for a championship for one of the first times in his career in the biggest market in basketball. It's true. I don't know how he's going to handle it, but he's going to have to figure out how to, because this is a completely different situation from where he played in Minnesota. And what else is interesting, speaking of Minnesota, is that relationship with Tom Thibodeau, his former coach with the Timberwolves. He was coaching when Jimmy Butler was with Minnesota for 1.5 seasons. I think it was from 2016 to 2018, if I'm not mistaken. That was Thibodeau's tenure. I'm not sure I have the numbers 100%, but that relationship was a little bit rocky. Maybe they mended the relationship, which is why the Knicks decided to do this trade, because maybe Thibodeau believes that Karl-Anthony Towns will be disciplined enough to go out there, do his role on a championship contending team. But those times were shaky in Minnesota, especially the Jimmy Butler days. Yes, that was the first time Minnesota made the playoffs in a very long time, but it wasn't pretty. And we saw what happened in training camp in 2018 with the whole Jimmy Butler debacle, with calling out Karl-Anthony Towns, with Thibodeau not really doing that much in that situation at that time. So maybe things are a little bit rocky there. Maybe Thibodeau's going to push Karl-Anthony Towns a little bit harder, but at the same point, the Knicks wouldn't have made this trade probably without Tom Thibodeau's approval. So that's another interesting aspect of this trade. And again, with the pressure that he's going to have to listen to Thibodeau. He's going to have to hear it every day from him, every day from the fans. This is not going to be easy. And remember, Karl-Anthony Towns hasn't been that great in the postseason when he has had the opportunities presented to him. Last year, he was awful in the conference finals. A few years ago, he didn't play great in that Memphis Grizzlies series. Karl-Anthony Towns hasn't necessarily been the best playoff performer. And if he doesn't perform on this team as the second best guy on a championship contending team, this team is not going to get close to the championship. We're going to get into this a little bit later, but look at the rest of the East now. Philadelphia, you've got Indiana, Orlando rising. You still got Cleveland and Milwaukee in the mix. You never know about the Heat. And of course, the defending champs of the Celtics. This East is very, very good. There can be no mistakes by Karl-Anthony Towns here. He is going to have to play his role that the Knicks want, and he's going to have to execute it to perfection, because I trust Tom Thibodeau. I know Tom Thibodeau's made some questionable decisions in the past, but look at where this Knicks team was a few years ago compared to where it is now, from the start of his tenure to the end of his tenure. Of course, you got to give a lot of credit to Leon Rose, because, I mean, their starting lineup was like Alfred Payton, Barrett, Randle, Mario Hezonja, guys like that. He really turned around this Knicks team from that to this. But at the end of the day, where all the blame's going to go, it's not going to be Leon Rose. It's not going to be Tom Thibodeau. It is going to be Karl-Anthony Towns. So he has to be worried about that. Now let's talk about Julius Randle for a little bit, because Julius Randle he was pretty much on the trade block for a while now, ever since that disappointing playoff series in 2023 against the Miami Heat. He's been pretty much on that block for probably the Knicks trying to look to get an upgrade from Julius Randle or trying to do something with him because he did not necessarily play the best in the postseason. But the one thing that Knicks fans really forget about Julius Randle was that he was the savior of this franchise. You looked at the direction the New York Knicks were going. It was going down, down, down with the whole Carmelo Anthony situation. Then after he left, they weren't really doing anything. Then Julius Randle decides to sign with the Knicks. The Knicks in 2021 make the playoffs as a 4 seed. It was really the start of the climb to the New York Knicks ascending to this championship contending team, and he brought a lot to this New York Knicks franchise. He averaged 24 points per game. He hit many game winners. He was the guy a lot, especially before Brunson, who had the ball in his hands. And it's a little bit of a different role that he played in New York that Karl-Anthony Towns is probably too, which is part of the reason why he got traded, because Randle, when he wants to score, he really needs the ball in his hands. Karl-Anthony Towns doesn't necessarily need the ball in his hands. He gets set up, pick and roll, pick and pop, can get in the post a little bit. He doesn't really necessarily need the ball for 5 seconds to get his shots. Randle's more of the guy, give me the ball on the block, let me do my work, get out of the way. He's that kind of player. I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I'm just saying that the Knicks didn't really need that because Jalen Brunson was their main ball handler. On a team that may not necessarily have the strongest point guard, I think Randle would be a great fit for it. But for the Knicks team that was currently constructed with Brunson, he just didn't really like fit in the mix of what they were doing. And especially when he went out against the Miami Heat this past January when he had his season-ending injury, even without him, the Knicks looked great. They had a stretch where they were 21-4 with OG Anunoby getting in there. So the more time progressed, the more I guess that the Knicks, that pretty much the rest of the world could see it, that Randle wasn't really a necessity on this team, and he could probably get traded for somebody better than him. But again, he was the one who helped this New York Knicks team ascend. I did really like it that the Knicks tried to do some nice things after they left. The fans are like, thank you, Julius, for helping us ascend. That was all good and well because Julius Randle got a lot of pressure being a New York Knick. And as I mentioned, Karl-Anthony Towns is probably going to get way more. But for how good Julius Randle was, for how much he tried to revive the Knicks as the best player on that team, he heard it. He heard it a lot. And part of that is to blame because of his lack of stepping up in the playoffs. But he received a lot of pressure, and it must have been tough for Julius Randle. Now he gets a fresh restart in Minnesota where he can have a little bit less pressure, can have the ball a little bit more, not really hear it from anybody, and just go out and do his best playing basketball on a contract season. So I really think that the move for Randle is going to be good. I think it was eventually inevitable, whether that was now, whether that was at the trade deadline, whether that he was going to walk during free agency. I guess the Knicks probably were going to assume that, which is why they traded him. But it was definitely time to move on from Julius Randle if you were the New York Knicks. Now there is 0 players left from that 2021 Knicks team except for Mitchell Robinson. So they've pretty much, Leon Rose and the guys in the front office pretty much have descended that team and used all those assets to make this new New York Knicks team. And they are going all in. And the one thing that we didn't get to see because the Knicks did this was the Nova Knicks. We didn't really get to see the Nova Knicks. And when I refer to the Nova Knicks, I mean the 4 guys in Villanova. I mean Brunson, Hart. Well, I mean, we've seen those 2, DiVincenzo and Bridges, all on the court at the same time. How special would that have been? I mean, Villanova is a historic college basketball program, which was under Jay Wright for many years before he eventually retired and sent the program forward. But that Villanova program developed a lot of NBA players, brought a lot of players to the league. And the fact that there was 4 of them, especially from the same time period, from that 2016 to 2018 time period, for them to all join up on this Knicks team, it was special. It's probably special for Jay Wright. It's just special for college programs, the world of college basketball, to see this in general. Because, look, we've got 4 guys, same time, same program, being successful at the same time on the same NBA team. And now we don't get to see that. And as I mentioned earlier, I don't think the Knicks wanted Donte DiVincenzo to be in this trade, but maybe Donte wanted to be in this trade because you look at the Knicks before this trade. I mean, you're going with a Brunson, Bridges, Anunoby, Julius, Randle, and probably a Josh Hart lineup. And I don't think DiVincenzo really wanted to see his role go down. And I don't really blame DiVincenzo for saying that, because he did average 18 points per game last year. He did shoot 40% from the 3-point line. And when you're really trying to carry the load on this team, especially with all the injuries the Knicks dealt with, it's hard to really accept a lesser role. And DiVincenzo really was that guy for the Knicks last season, who really pushed them through all the injuries, who really had a career season, shooting the most threes, making the most threes in the league behind, of course, the great Wardell, Stephen Curry. DiVincenzo was the savior last year. I mean, the Knicks wouldn't have been the second seed without him, that's for sure. He was great in the playoffs. Remember his Game 2 game winner when they were down by 5, hit 2 threes in a row, and DiVincenzo hit that second one, and the Garden probably went as crazy the Garden went crazy as it's ever been in a very long time. That's how great that DiVincenzo game winner was. And he brought a lot of great memories to that Knicks team from last season. And it was probably unfortunate to see him go if you're a Knicks fan. It's a tough loss. And as I mentioned, the 3-point shooting, considering Josh Hart's not necessarily the greatest 3-point shooter. I mean, Deuce McBride, he's improving, but he's not there yet. There's not really a lot of guards who can replace the 3-point shooting. So they think Karl-Anthony Towns can, and we'll see how he tries to make up for DiVincenzo's production. But something you should definitely look for early is the Knicks 3-point production, because we know in this league, in order to win, you're going to have to make a lot of threes. That's just how the new world of the NBA is. So I would definitely look out for it, and this is something I'm definitely going to watch. How are the New York Knicks running their offense, especially beyond the perimeter? How are they setting up for 3-point shots? Are guys like Josh Hart and Miles McBride stepping up to hit those 3-point shots? Is Karl-Anthony Towns going to be that much of a difference? We will see, but that is definitely a big loss. But I don't necessarily blame the Knicks but again, it's a tough loss. Moving on, though, and evaluate how much the Knicks got better compared to the rest of the East now that they both got Karl-Anthony Towns and Mikal Bridges. So when we're looking at the rest of the East, as I mentioned a couple of minutes ago, you have Boston, of course, at the top. Then there's this tier below what I think the Knicks are in, which is the young loomers, which is the Pacers and the Magic. And then the tier above that, in between the Boston and the young loomers tier, I have the New York Knicks and Philadelphia 76ers. Do I think this trade makes the Knicks better than the Philadelphia 76ers? No, I do not. I do believe, and I still believe, that Philadelphia will do better than the Knicks this year, and the 76ers will make the conference finals. Not to say that the Knicks didn't get better than last season. I just think the entire East got a lot better. I think Philadelphia got a lot better, and I think this is finally going to be the year that the 76ers are going to do something in the postseason, because it has to happen eventually. And if not now, when? Of course, you have Boston. I mean, if you don't think the Celtics are going to make the Eastern Conference Finals, I don't know who you are, because it's the Boston Celtics. Then you could make the case. But at the same point, you have Embiid to guard Karl-Anthony Towns. Embiid can guard on the perimeter. I think Paul George is going to be a good addition in stopping potentially a Jalen Brunson, containing a Mikal Bridges or an OG Anunoby on the wing. The 76ers, I think, are built to beat a team like the New York Knicks. So do I think the New York Knicks got better? Maybe. Time will tell. But I don't think, in retrospect to separating themselves from the 76ers and getting closer to the Celtics, do I think they did that? I do not, because I think it will be a very similar matchup. Going to the Timberwolves side of things, though, now evaluating what they did in the trade, it's a little bit surprising. It didn't really make sense to me at first, as I mentioned earlier, but the more I thought about it this week, the more I looked at this situation, I'm like, is this really as bad of a trade as people think it is for the Minnesota Timberwolves? Because in my opinion, I don't think it's that bad. Because Karl-Anthony Towns signed an extension, 5 years, 200-something million, making around $60 million a year. It's a lot of money. And when you get rid of that contract and instead you get Julius Randle, who is on an expiring contract with a player option, and you get Donte DiVincenzo, a great asset to add to your bench, is it that bad for the Timberwolves? I don't think so, because now you have this situation with the Timberwolves here where if you're them, you evaluate what Julius Randle does. If you like him, you re-sign him for a lesser number than Karl-Anthony Towns. You don't, you let him walk. Plain and simple. There is nothing wrong that the Timberwolves did here, because now it creates more flexibility for the future of Anthony Edwards. Now, do I think that this move could have been determined at the trade deadline, just like I thought the Knicks could have looked at their roster? Absolutely. The Timberwolves just made the conference finals. They just beat the defending NBA champions before this season in the playoffs in the Denver Nuggets. They swept Kevin Durant, Devin Booker, and Bradley Beal. That's not hard. That's not an easy thing to accomplish. The Timberwolves had a great basketball team, and I think they still have a great basketball team right now. Do I think they should have waited? Yes, but it does create flexibility. I mean, you couldn't trade Rudy Gobert. You're not going to get necessarily the same back that you would if you traded him rather than Karl-Anthony Towns, which is why I think this is important. And you look at the three center system that the Timberwolves tried to accomplish here with Towns, Gobert, and Naz Reid. It just didn't really work because you couldn't really put them all at the floor at one time. You tried to, but it just didn't really work. It just felt like something was off. If Towns and Gobert were on, it felt like Towns was just standing around being useless on defense. If Towns and Gobert were on for offense, it felt like Gobert had no place on being on the court on offense. Like, it just didn't work out. And then you have the Naz Reid aspect, which we'll get into in a little bit. The whole thing was just weird. It was just flat out weird, and it just didn't work out for how good Minnesota was. That center system that they tried to do, going all in with Rudy Gobert, trading a lot of their assets and first-round picks, it just didn't pay off at the end, and we saw it get exposed in the conference finals against the Mavericks. Did it work against a team like the Denver Nuggets, who play big, play physical? Absolutely. That's a team that Minnesota and Tim Connelly, who was the former GM of the Denver Nuggets, was designed to beat. Tim Connelly built the Denver Nuggets, went to Minnesota, and built a team that beat the Denver Nuggets. But that team probably couldn't beat a young, fast team with guard-heavy players like the Dallas Mavericks or like the Oklahoma City Thunder. That was not what the Timberwolves were designed to do. So at the end of the day, that team did not work out for what they wanted to accomplish. I thought they were great, and maybe they should have waited. I probably do think they should have given it another opportunity, but I do understand the logic and the reasoning behind it, especially how that system went, creating more flexibility for Anthony Edwards, because trust me, the Timberwolves are not done here. This is not going to be a move where Minnesota's going to settle. They're going to run the whole season with this roster and see what happens. The Timberwolves are going to make another move somewhere. I don't know if that's trading Mike Conley. I don't know if that's getting some veteran players and trading them for another piece on the bench. I don't know if that's trading a guy like who they just drafted in Rob Dillingham. I don't know what it is from the Timberwolves, but I don't think either them or the Knicks, who I mentioned earlier, are done with moves. There is more to be made for both teams to complete the roster, and I expect both of these teams to be active during the trade deadline. But the Randle deal is interesting here because I think he could be great with the Timberwolves. I do. But I also think there's a lot of potential for him to be a bust. I said it a little bit earlier, but Randle, what he does is he requires the ball in his hands to make a move. I don't know if that's going to take the ball out of Anthony Edwards. I don't know if that's going to be a system where, hey, Mike Conley, pass the ball to Edwards here, let him work. Now give it to Randle, let him work, just sit around, ISO ball all the time. I don't know what kind of system it's going to be for Chris Finch. He's going to have to figure that out. And I hope the ISO ball is not the case because I think that's a worst case scenario because today in the NBA where you just sit around, watch players go one-on-one, that doesn't work. And to me, that is a possible scenario I can see with this team because both of those guys require the ball. So Randle is going to have to do a little bit of adjusting to his game. Can he get in the post a little bit more? Can he quicken his shot production? Can he become a distributor? Can he continue hitting some three-point shots? Because it's not going to be a situation for the past 2 years with New York. Hey, give me the ball, get out of my way, give me all the time I need, and I'm going to get you 24 points per game. Because he's not the number one guy like he was with the Knicks for a while. This is Anthony Edwards' team. I hope Julius Randle knows going into this that this is not his team. This is a team built around the number one pick in 2020, a team that was led to the conference finals by Anthony Edwards. This is his team. There is no questions, no disputes about it. So if Julius Randle goes with the approach, I'm walking in, I'm the best player on this team, just give me the ball, it's not going to work out. Randle will have to adjust to his game for this to work. But I do like the closing lineup. If I see a closing lineup of DiVincenzo, Edwards, Jaden McDaniels, Randle, and Naz Reid, I like that a lot. I like that a lot more than people think because I think that's a really decent closing lineup. And Randle can help in those aspects. Now, can we rely on Randle to be healthy on the court for the Timberwolves? That's a question that we have to answer because Randle's been inconsistent with the injuries the past couple of seasons. And for order for this trade and this new team to work, he's going to have to be on the court. And he's going to have to adjust because the Timberwolves are going to need all the continuity, all the offensive system figured out before the playoffs. Because if you don't have an offensive system, you don't have a continuity before the postseason, you're screwed. We saw that with the Phoenix Suns this year who got swept by the Timberwolves. They had no idea what they were doing because all of them were injured. They didn't play on the court for more than 20 games together. There was no continuity built. So we're going to have to stay healthy. That's number one. I trust most of those guys. Randle is a different question. So he's going to be a big part in that. Now, something that could potentially drive Minnesota to also do this trade was someone on their team. And he's sitting right now in the backup center position. And he was the sixth man of the year. And that's Naz Reid. Naz Reid averaged 11 points per game, 4 rebounds per game. Okay, that's okay. Saw him in the postseason. Naz Reid was 10 times better than that. Naz Reid is going to be a very, very good player in this league for a long time. He can stretch the floor like Towns did. He has a very similar game, can get on the inside, and he's a lot younger than Karl-Anthony Towns. Naz Reid was an undrafted in, 2020, if I'm not mistaken? So he is a lot younger than Karl-Anthony Towns. And this opens the door. This opens the opportunity for Naz Reid to get more minutes. And could I see him starting against Gobert? Probably not. But Will he get more minutes because of Karl-Anthony Towns not being there? Absolutely. And I expect a big jump from Naz Reid. And I think Minnesota is sort of banking on that with this trade. And I don't blame them, because what I saw from Naz Reid last playoffs was a mini Karl-Anthony Towns. I saw him hit some threes. I saw him hit some jump shots. I saw him get to the line a lot. Naz Reid was great in the postseason. So we should expect more from him this season. And don't be surprised. Maybe he wins most improved player. Maybe he is in those conversations to be an all-star. Because if this Timberwolves team is going to work, you're going to have to make up the production that Towns brought. And Julius Randle is going to be a part of that. Donte DiVincenzo is going to be a part of that. But it also has to happen internally. Is Jaden McDaniels, like Chris Finch said, one of the hardest working guys in the gym this offseason, is he going to step up his offensive production? Because we know how great he is defensively. As I mentioned, is it going to be Naz Reid? Is it going to be the rookie who they traded for, Rob Dillingham from Kentucky? Is he going to bring something that we don't expect? Somebody's going to have to step up. And I believe it's going to be Naz Reid, but there's going to be other factors in this. And I think what Minnesota thought was, if we can get these two guys, create more flexibility with the Randle contract, potentially make more trades down the line, sign a big guy in free agency, as I mean big guy, not necessarily a center, but like a star, an all-star type of caliber player in free agency. Let's bank on our young guys who played great in the playoffs, and we'll see what happens from there. That was Minnesota's approach. And it's not necessarily a bad thing, especially when you're bringing in something that the Timberwolves lacked a lot, which is shooting with Donte DiVincenzo. And as I mentioned earlier, DiVincenzo was amazing for the New York Knicks last season. He was the guy. He was the glue guy for the Knicks. He was the one who came in, made up the production for everyone who was injured, had a career year, 18 points per game. You could have even made the case that a lot of games he was playing at an all-star caliber. Now, DiVincenzo will most likely come off the bench because I expect Mike Conley to remain the starting point guard, but he will definitely be in the closing lineup. I mean, I mentioned it earlier. DiVincenzo, Edwards, McDaniels, Randle, and Naz Reid at a closing five. That is a great closing five. And what you also did was improve your depth, because with the Timberwolves, you looked at the roster. Where was the depth? Was it Joe Ingles? Other than Naz Reid and Kyle Anderson? You didn't really have a lot. Now you have DiVincenzo, you signed Joe Ingles, you still have Naz Reid, you traded for Rob Dillingham. This is a much deeper team, and this helps with contending teams, because we know players are going to get injured, and if contending teams want to have home court in the playoffs, they're going to need some of their bench guys to step up in some regular season games. And you could tell in that postseason last year, Anthony Edwards was tired. Against Denver, you saw it. He was gassed. And by the time he got to the conference finals, Anthony Edwards wasn't the same player because he had to play so many minutes. And why? Because the Timberwolves didn't have a bench to support him. That's why. And if we got the Anthony Edwards we saw against Denver for most of the series, against the Phoenix Suns, that Mavericks series could have been a whole different conversation. You saw how close they were to winning both games 2 and 3. Those were close games. The series could have been different. So I think by adding depth, giving Anthony Edwards a more all-around roster, supporting him, giving him potential more rest in the regular season, prepping him for that playoffs, and even when he needs it, more rest in the postseason, this is not a bad trade for the Timberwolves. And to answer the question on the screen, do I think they got better? No. Do I think they got worse? Probably not. So I really do think they got more different than better or worse. It was, for both teams, just a interesting kind of a move where you go look at it and say, did we get better? Probably not. We didn't get worse. We still have the surrounding pieces. We either added more depth or added a star. It's just a different look for both of these teams, which is what ultimately makes the trade that much more interesting. And we will see what happens with these teams, and definitely look early in the regular season to see how these teams adjust, even in the preseason, which games start today. Very excited about that. The Abu Dhabi games, the Denver Nuggets and the Boston Celtics. And of course, JJ Redick makes his quote-unquote coaching debut against the Minnesota Timberwolves. This is going to be a great day, a great first day of basketball finally being back. But I would definitely pay attention to what these two teams do, because this was not just a trade for these two teams where it affects only them. This is a league-shifting trade. These two teams are at the top of their conferences. It was an unusual trade, and it happened on the same day as the Damian Lillard trade. You never know what could happen in September, late September, that point where you're just about to start media day, you're just about to start training camp, and all of a sudden, things could alter in the league just like that. And that is it for today's episode. We broke down the entire Karl-Anthony Towns blockbuster trade to the New York Knicks. I hope you enjoyed watching it, and please remember to subscribe. It will mean a lot to me. Leave a like, comment. Follow me on Instagram at take_your_shot_podcast_, and tell me how you would have taken your shots on my takes. That's all my shots for the week. We will see you next week, breaking down some preseason games finally and giving you some early storylines that we have in training camp. That's it for me. Have a great rest of your week.